Welcome back to the Blackletter Podcast. We set out to create an entertaining and exciting podcast about law and business. Blackletter, the name, comes from the Gothic typeset. Over time, Blackletter became the only font that English law books were printed in. It made it harder for kind of the common person to understand what the English law books said. Blackletter came to represent something that was law, that was set in stone, that was sort of old and a well-settled fundamental principle of law. We're here to demystify black-letter law. We're here to demystify things that happen in business and law and where those two meet. And I hope you have fun listening. Welcome back to another episode of the Blackletter Podcast. With me today, I have Sharon Heaton and Wright Lewis, both of them experts in their field. Wright is an M&A attorney with Dunlap Bennett Ludwig, a partner there, and Sharon has a company called sbLiftOff, which helps companies get ready to go to market, figure out their valuation, get through the sale of their company, and with post-closing stuff. And we're going to talk about all of that happy stuff today. You're going to know by the end of this how venture capital and private equity and other people value companies and how you need to look at your company and get it ready for sale. We're going to talk about what the sale process is like when you sell your company in multiples, all those fun, fancy VC words. And at the end, we'll talk about post-closing stuff and what happens if you have, say, for example, an obligation to stay at your company after the sale is done. Stuff happens. Okay, so without further ado, guys, let's just jump right into it for our listeners. A lot of our listeners out there own companies. A lot of our listeners out there are lawyers who need help with this kind of stuff because it's not what they do, or maybe it is what they do, and they just want to see what you know. Who knows? Well, let's start with preparing the business for sale. So, Sharon, what do you mean by preparing the business for sale, right? And Sharon, tell me a little bit about that.
Certainly. Thomas, it's a pleasure to be here with you and, of course, my colleague and friend, Wright. What it takes to get a company sold is really two different time periods. The first is the time period before you're actually going to market, and that's when you're running your company. And there's all sorts of things that you can and should be doing while you're running your company to prepare it to be successfully marketed later. Then, of course, there's the time period once you've decided I'm going to market and the things that need to be done there. Right. My experience is that the folks who have been planning to go to market for years are the ones who are more likely to get a result that is agreeable to them than those that kind of decide on the spur of the moment. What is your experience?
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Sharon. I often will tell people that I'm talking to who, have been running their business for 20 or 30 years. And, they haven't even mentioned necessarily, selling the company. And I'll just let them know, don't wait until you're burnt out or until you're ready to hang it up. Running your business and selling your business are both full-time jobs as far as I'm concerned. And you really want to have a good plan. You want to grow into the sale to maximize your enterprise value. And you need to take the time to do things like making yourself redundant if you're not already redundant. And there's a lot of things that, your legal and financial advisors and other people like yourself can suggest and implement.
So, right. Let me ask you about that. When you say making yourself redundant, that's super interesting to me because I've kind of been through this process with clients. And in fact, we've had offers at the firm. But making yourself redundant, what does that mean? And how hard is that? Can either of you speak to that? Because that is an interesting concept. And I think it's one that's not well understood or frankly thought about by a lot of business owners who have been the center of their business.
Yeah. Well, I'll start and then I'll hand it out to Sharon.
Okay.
I know she's dealt with this a lot as well. I mean, initially, is that easy or difficult? I think the real answer there is depends on the owner. Some people are much easier and better at giving up control than others. And I think the longer you've been, you had your hands in every aspect of the business, the harder it's going to be to do that. Also, the earlier you start, the more chance you have of actually hiring people that you can then train and use to replace a lot of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Okay. Sharon, any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think that there's a fundamental difference between having a company, which is an entity independent in and of itself, versus having a job with staff helping you do that job. And weirdly enough, the more important the business owner is, the less valuable that company is. If in fact that business owner, God forbid, were to go out into the parking lot and get struck by lightning, what happens to that company the next day? If that owner is the one who has the client relationships, is the business development person, is the one who has the subject matter expertise, it's really a problem. A couple of years ago, I was sitting with a business owner. He had about a $20 million company, and it was involved in food preparation and delivery. It was a national company. It was profitable. And as I'm sitting there talking to him about his desire to sell the company, people keep on walking in the room and saying, hey, Mary didn't show up. What should we do? The sink is backed up. What do we do? The delivery didn't come. And I'm saying after about 45 minutes, I turned to this guy and said, you don't have a company. You're making all these decisions. You don't have people who are empowered to know what to do.
Wow.
If in fact, God forbid, you were to get struck by lightning. So very often business owners will beat their chest about how hard they work and how important they are to their company. And they need to understand that that's terrific, but it actually diminishes the value of your company, because when somebody puts money into your pocket, they're going to assume that you're not going to work as hard for them as you did prior to that.
Well, and the other thing is, I mean, at least from what I've seen, is it's hard for the owner to sell the business and move on. You're stuck there in any sale, right? There are agreements that require the owner to stay for a certain period. The more you're in the business, it seems like to me, if I was buying your business, I would want you to stay for a minimum period of time and make sure that all of those things change.
Absolutely. I tell business owners that your company is probably going to be more valuable if you can do an appropriate transition period. Now, truth is, an appropriate transition period can be as short as 4 weeks, and it could go on indefinitely. But most transition periods are somewhere between 1 and 6 months, maybe a year. And part of the reason for that is that entrepreneurs tend to make terrible employees. They have been the ones making all the decisions for a lot of time, for a lot of years. And now having to go get permission from somebody else grates them. It's challenging. When a decision is made that isn't the decision that they would make, whether it's right or wrong, it's uncomfortable. So, unless you are a specific kind of person and really have a lot of runway left, assume that you're going to be there for a transition period and then move on. If in fact you're selling an interest where you're going to stay there as the management, then you need to make sure that you and whoever those buyers are have a clear understanding of where the company is going, that you're in alignment on that, and what your role and authority is going to be during that transition period.
Okay. So tell me, what kind of businesses do you, Sharon and Wright, what kind of businesses do you sell? Are they restaurants? Are they national food companies is one for sure, but what are the types of businesses, and how long does it take to sell a business? How does all this work?
Excellent question. sbLiftOff focuses in on B2B services. We do B2B services, niche manufacturing, and things like that. We don't work in retail. We don't work in restaurants. We don't work in cash-based businesses. But if you've got some geeky widget that you are building that is critical to XYZ infrastructure, that is where we spend our time. So we do services and manufacturing, and it's usually B2B.
I know for sure you also do a lot of sort of B2G type work as well.
Absolutely.
So, the vast majority of what I'm involved with is the same kind of B2B lower middle market, usually 5 to 40 million in revenue. And a lot of those are the same types of entities that Sharon was talking about, whether those are B2G services, B2B services, some tech, and various different industries. Basically, what exists in sort of the DC metropolitan area in terms of the types of entities that exist here. But really, it's mostly the size of business that I'm mostly involved with, in terms of, we're selling a business that is $5 to $40 million in enterprise value and usually does have the infrastructure, around the owner for the most part, even if the owner wants to keep their hands in everything.
And that infrastructure is very important. We talked a lot about the importance of the owner, but the organizational structure of the entity really matters. Is there essentially a hub and spokes where the business owner is at the center and everything kind of comes off that person? Or is there a more normal organization chart where there's somebody who's responsible for bringing in the work, somebody who's responsible for making sure the work gets done, and then back office issues being handled as well? Are there people who are not necessarily owners who have a vested interest, doesn't have to be ownership, but who care about the success of that company and are working towards the success of that entity outside the people who own the company? Are they the only ones who do that?
Okay. Can I ask now, so how long does it take to sell businesses, and what do businesses need to do to get ready to go to market?
Two very different questions. So let me,
Okay.
and I'm going to give this answer to you both because as a recovering lawyer, talking to lawyers, you'll appreciate this answer. It
Okay.
depends. It's the classic lawyer answer of it depends. I've had people come to sbLiftOff and say, I want to sell, and then they hand us unbelievably well-organized documentation and they're ready to go. And I've had people say they want to sell, and when I say, what does your future revenue look like? They say, let me take a picture of my whiteboard and I'll send that to you. So those two companies will take a very different amount of time to get to the market. So as I said before, there's really two time periods. The time that you're not on the market, but you're doing prep work to get there. That can go on for years. And it should go on for at least a year or two where the owner is thinking about it and making choices. Once you're in the process of saying, okay, we're getting ready to sell, there's basically, and we could talk about this in a little bit, some stages to the process. But if it goes extremely quickly, it's 5 to 6 months. And that's really fast.
Right.
Certainly 9 to 12 months is pretty normal. And it's not unusual to see a process go on for a year and a half or longer. And we could talk about why that varies.
How often do you hear a business owner come in and say, I'd like to get it done in 30 days? I think we get this wrapped up in 30 days.
I think I had that conversation earlier today. Pretty much every business owner thinks, well, this will be easy. My records are in great shape. Somebody's going to want this company. We'll come to an agreement. It'll be a little bit of an LOI, but then, 2 weeks later, we can close the transaction. That exists in fantasy world, not in real life.
What do businesses have to do to get ready to sell the business? What steps do they need to take internally besides making themselves redundant? What are the other things they need to do?
There's several different component parts to this. The first, of course, is the financials. Where's the company financially? Has the company been seeing its revenue increase for the last 2 or 3 or 4 years, or has it been seeing its revenue decrease? Doesn't mean that you can't sell if your revenue is decreasing, but you have to understand that there's going to be an impact on valuation if you've seen declining revenue. Similarly, are your margins going up or going down? How much of your net income that gets converted to EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, and then get adjusted to adjusted EBITDA, something that we can talk about in the valuation section. How many adjustments do you have? I mean, I've had companies that basically when you look at them, it looks like they're break even at best. But when you start adjusting out their EBITDA, they get to 2.5 million. Well, 2.5 million in EBITDA could be really good, but a buyer's going to look at that differently if it's all adjustments than if, in fact, that's what the company is doing. So there's a lot of factors. So the financial stuff's very, very important. People also, particularly in this part of the market, are very focused on historic financials. Let me show you what we did in 22, 23, 24. Great. But buyers are very interested in the future. So you need to be able to make projections as to what revenue do you think you're going to do by the end of the year in 25, 26. Buyers.
Let me ask you, Sharon. I mean, a business owner is going to say to you, though, aren't my historical records an indication of my future revenue? How do you deal with that kind of question?
They are an indication, but it's not determinative. At this point, pretty much most deals, there's something called a quality of earnings done by the buyer of the seller. And the quality of earnings is when the buyers basically hiring accountants to do this incredibly intrusive process to determine whether or not the revenue that you had in the previous 12 months, in fact, is reflective of what you're going to see in the future. For instance, maybe you had great revenue, but you sold an asset. Well, you're not going to sell an asset every year. Maybe you had a great money, but it's with a client whose contract is about to end or who is no longer working with you. So you need to show people, yes, every year we've traditionally lost, I don't know, I'm making up numbers, 10%, 15% of our clients, but we've replaced them with an additional 15 or 20%. And that's how we grow. So you need to look at the past to be able to predict the future. And you can't simply say, this is what happened before, it'll happen again.
Gotcha. Sorry, I derailed you a little bit. So,
no, that's okay.
So what about, so pipeline we talked about, what about organizational structure?
Are there people at the company who have definitive roles so that the business owner is not the all-important one? The question I often ask business owners is, can you go on vacation? Can you go on vacation for a 1-week period of time? And how often are you on the phone with the company? What would happen if, God forbid, you went on vacation for 2 weeks? Would things simply continue on? Would people simply be treading waters? No new business would be brought in while you were gone, but the work would be delivered. Understanding the structure of the company, because that company absolutely needs to be an independent entity from the owners. Right? I'm sure you deal with this all the time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're kind of this question kind of circles back to the making yourself redundant question. But part of this is just having that infrastructure in place. Like Sharon talked about earlier, having people that care about the success of the business moving forward, and that may or may not have to do with equity or executive leadership roles or whatever it is that your people care about, right? And what motivates them. And maybe that's just the right bonus incentives and putting together a good comp plan that makes them invested in the growth and profitability of the company, that type of thing. But these are the types of things that you can put in place ahead of time to help maximize that enterprise value on exit.
What I love about this part of the market is that so many business owners care a lot about their employees and very often want to share some of the benefits of the sale with those employees. And one thing that's become popular is something called change of control agreements. Now, here's my soapbox. I love change of control agreements. They're fantastic. They're good for the seller. It's good for the employees. It's very good for the buyer, structured properly. Traditionally, a change of control agreement basically said when the seller sells control, the employee is going to come into a lot of money. That is a terrible idea, because what happens is that employee comes into a lot of money and they're not vested in the continuing success of that company. If in fact you take that exact same amount of money and you pay it to the employee over, let's say, a 12 to 18 month period of time, that adds value to your company because the buyer knows those people are likely to stay there for that time period, so that you don't need to have a retention payment. You're already taking care of it, and it gives stability to the buyer, which puts more money in the seller's pocket. So there are lots of tricks to these things that are really worth talking to people to understand how to do it smart.
Talking to pros. And so that's what we're going to do when we come back on our next episode. I think we're going to talk about the 3 stages of the M&A process, and then valuation will be our one after that, or does that kind of work into the stages? Okay, so next, the 3 stages of the M&A process. That's its own thing. So thank you, audience, for listening to this Blackletter episode. If you're watching Sharon right now, I will tell you right now, if you listen to it and you go back and watch it, we have slides. Sharon has fantastic slides that break this stuff out, particularly relevant in the next couple sections. So if you listen to this one, maybe jump over to our YouTube channel and watch these next. We'll see you guys back here in the Blackletter Podcast. Download us wherever you get your podcasts, iHeartRadio, iTunes, wherever. We'll see you next time here. That's all for today's episode of Blackletter. Thanks again for listening. Join us next time when we talk about more Blackletter issues in creative ways. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and check out our website at blackletterstudios.com.